This is Van Electric Ghost, and we're live on the air for the first time with Christy and Carron for the first time. Is that right? I
Yes, it
got
is.
you.
Thank you for having me.
Good. I want to let everybody know we are a featured podcast on the Newsly platform. So if you use coupon code GHOST, you can get 1 month free premium subscription to stop scrolling and start listening. We are a featured podcast on that platform. And so we'll be on there later tonight. I also want to let people know that are just listening. We have a link on here, www.goodjelly.com, and /way dash masterclass. And that brings you to the registration for your masterclass that we'll be talking about, further on. But want to let the audio people who are listening on an audio podcast and know that's something they can, if they can't, click it right now, they'll click it on the video podcast when it goes up on Facebook.
Wonderful.
So you've been a writer and a productivity expert, and you're the founder of Goodjelly. So maybe you can talk about where you want to start. Do you want to start as a writer, as your writing position, or your founding of a Goodjelly? You can kind of start where you want to.
Well, everything's related for me. So in my corporate career, I was a process improvement consultant and project manager and productivity expert. And then I stepped away from full-time corporate job and became an independent consultant. And at the same time, started pursuing my writing. And over time, as I, kept on the writing adventure and I would attend writing conferences, I would hear other writers talking, and a lot of times they were frustrated or struggling, but it really had nothing to do with the writing per se, with the art. It was about getting organized or the process of querying if they were pursuing a traditional publishing route. And one day I just had the thought, wow, this doesn't have to be so hard. That if writers could only learn some core process, project management, mindset, in a holistic way, it would make the writing adventure so much easier. And from that thought at a writing conference years later, that was the kernel that started Goodjelly, where I help writers take charge of their writing adventures with smart process, grounded power, and inner kindness.
Is this for like creative writers, or like I'm a technical writer? I'm in IT. So within IT, we have a certain discipline because we're in software development. We use
Yes.
Agile, been doing it for 20 years. We have, we're working against project plans. We're using Agile methodology, using user stories. So we already have that kind of discipline. And as a
Yes.
musician, I tend to kind of take some of that and bring it into my production
Ab
as a producer.
Absolutely. Yes,
But I
and
would
the
other people might have a hard time.
is the method that I created is actually agile based. So it's pretty much agile for artists. But what I found is you have the benefit and luxury of really having integrated that into the way you work. And then with your music, it's 100% transferable. But I would watch writers and they wouldn't necessarily be able to make that leap. They
Mm.
would be fearful. And even some folks in the corporate world, when you talk project management, they think, oh, it's going to lock me down or constrict me. And so it's finding out how process can really set creativity free, set productivity free. So for me, it's very exciting.
Yeah, there's a lot of cool things, a lot of tools for musicians is I have tools that I can just turn on multi-tracks that
Yeah,
automatically put things into their own channels. And
right.
so I can just go and play anything I want and it gets separation. And so
Yeah,
basically it's all separated and later I can go and move it around. And so
yeah,
then I don't have to worry about trying to set it up. And I have tools that can bring AI in and have somebody start playing a
mhm,
bass line and say, well, make it sound like Monk or something. So we have a lot of modern tools if you're willing to take it. But I'm kind of old school. I have analog, I have acoustic, I have digital. So I try to take everything. And the way I look at it is like you take the technology that serves whatever you're doing. And there are
right.
some writers who are like, well, might say, well, I just want to do it with a pad and paper. I just want to do it with my typewriter. I don't feel comfortable with tech. So what do you do with people who are like that don't like tech?
Well, what's interesting is a lot of my method, I actually encourage like more of an analog board versus a tech board because there is something to, even in what you're saying with acoustic and you mix up the tools, that there's something with embodied cognition as well. And so that we don't just learn through our mind, we learn through how it's integrated. I grew up dancing, so that's
Hmm.
my original art form, and so movement is very, but just it's a different feeling of, I call them done boosts when you move something to done, but it's a
Hmm.
different integration of that, like, yes, when you get something done, when you actually take that post-it note and just like put
Move
it
it. Yeah.
over
Yeah.
into the done column.
It's kind of like an analog modular synthesizer. These are kind of old school. They're not digital, and
Yeah.
they actually have these points called controlled voltage points. And the whole point is this: we can override our whole system. We can
Mm.
actually change the workflow and make it do something that it wasn't built to do.
And
We have the
in what you're describing, are you that is that more like the sound, I am not a musician,
yeah.
so the
No,
soundboard like you see in the movies where they're moving things up and down?
yeah, it's like a soundboard, but it also looks like a telephone operator type thing. Where you
Wow.
remember the old school telephone operators, they
Yeah.
had wires and they plug them into the board.
See, I mean,
Modular.
even just watching you move, I'm like, that's so embodied cognition.
Yeah, and so what happens is you physically can move a wire and plug it
Yeah.
into a socket and override the workflow of the synthesizer.
And I
And
think that's like an extension of like neural pathways. You're physically making a new
connection, yeah.
connection and adjusting the creative process.
Yeah, a lot of people like you can do that digitally, but a lot of people feel that the old school analog way of doing it of physically taking a wire and moving it to a different position, kind of like you're playing Battleship, and
Right.
you're putting pegs in a board. It feels like more real when you physically do it versus doing it with a mouse.
Yeah,
And
I absolutely, and I think again, it's, they might not necessarily say it in that way, but it's part of their creative process is that embodied cognition. It is that movement in, it's I could imagine that it's a very intellectual thing to listen to the music and to listen to the sounds, but then you're physically moving the
changing things.
sound, which is
We
it's
do a
cool.
lot of we do a lot of things we call happy accidents or like
Mm,
creative expression that is less scientific. I might know there's a theory in synthesizer world
yeah,
called subtractive synthesis. Dr. Robert Moog, when he
mm,
created synthesizers, came up with a theory of how you actually create sounds from sound waves. And it's basically taking the attributes of sound waves and then editing those waveforms through different processing tools. And it
mm,
gets to the approximation of an acoustic instrument or something that's different, like a
mm,
weird sound, like a sci-fi sound that doesn't have a natural sound. And
okay,
so these ideas have an actual science to it, but there's an art to it where Dr. Robert Moog said he believed that his synthesizers had a consciousness. They
mm,
felt like they were a machine, but he felt like they had something that was like a spirit inside of them. So it's very interesting to me that an engineer and a
mm,
doctor of electrical engineering would say that his device actually has like a spirit and a soul in it. And as a musician, that's like, oh yeah, because what we do is like heart and soul. And I would think a
right,
writer is the same way. Like a lot of what
yeah,
you do is kind of like heart and soul and the mind. And there's some periods where you just kind of let the universe, like the muse, like as an artist, we might just
yeah,
have what we call a stream of consciousness session. And we
right,
just go with whatever we feel. And we
right,
go back and we edit it. But we feel
and
sometimes the best work comes from that.
I imagine that that's enabled by your deep integration of the fundamentals and the process and the trust of between you and the other musicians so that you can take the hints and the calls and responses, and
Mhm.
to me that's enabled, that's the kind of a beautiful paradox of how process or someone who's like you're talking about an engineer is in talking about perhaps what more people would associate with the right brain, artistic or soul or the freedom. But to me, that's the power of process, that it releases and enables and creates a stage for the art to dance across.
Yeah, you have to have some kind of parameters. You know,
Yeah.
like you have to have a paradigm. You have to
Mm,
have like your plan. Like if you're going to build a song, well, you got to have a bass line, you got to have a drum line, you got to have a vocal line, you got to have intro, you got to have an outro, maybe you have there's a structure, and
right.
you can do whatever you want with that structure. It could be jazz, it could be bebop, it could be whatever, it could be anything. But there's a certain structure to it, and you have to kind of know the bare bones structure, and then you can go anywhere you want, but you do have to have some fundamentals.
Right.
And so you're trying to bring the fundamentals of like in order to keep repeating that process, as an artist,
Yeah.
like how do you repeat painting, in a way
Right.
that, well, you're an artist. Like, well, how do I know I want to paint today? How do I know I want to write today? But you want to be consistent, you want to be productive. So how do you put some rigor into something that typically say, well, that's not something that should have rigor.
Right, and I think the difference for me is that, like, for me, there's an art and a craft to the writing itself, but there's an art and a craft to getting the writing done, and it's that subtle difference of what I'm bringing to writers, eh, and some writers reach me when, they're beautiful, beautiful writers. They're debut novelists, they're published novelists, but they're just not, they're burning out or they're struggling or they're kind of in
Mm,
despair because it still feels so hard. And so to me, the answer is not in the writing. It needs that, what you were talking about, the structure and the structure of process. But my I don't I teach, to me, like a framework, just like
mm,
agile is a very loose
yeah.
framework that can have many applications. But for me, my vision for a good jelly is a world where all writers delight in their creative process. So a process
Yeah.
enables you to, you know, express your art and engage and build a relationship with your art, that so you have a writing adventure you actually enjoy being on.
Yeah, it's kinda like when you have a user story, right? And,
Yeah.
you do it the old school way before the pandemic. We go on a big board, and we
Mm,
take a Post-it note, and we say, "Well, here's user story 1. It's part of this big epic," and
yes.
then we put the things together, and then if you're doing use cases, it's got the same kinda thing. You have actors. Actors
Right.
could be systems, they could be people, they could be whatever, and you start using visual tools that are kinda like workflow diagrams, and I actually worked in Japan
Mm,
for 2 years from 2004 to 2006, and we decided to use visual UML,
mhm.
to do the work, because what we found is like translating from English to Japanese and Japanese to English, things were getting missed.
Right.
But the one thing that was, like, common is logic, like
Yeah.
algebraic logic,
Yeah.
just doing a flow chart type of structure. So activity diagrams, I actually proposed using activity diagrams to cut down on the problems between the translation between
Mm,
Japanese and English. And we
mhm.
found that that actually worked fantastic. We were able to get things done way faster because it
Yeah.
was everybody was understanding what we were saying, no matter what if you
Right.
were Japanese or English,
Right.
you can figure it out.
Right, and applying, so toward the end of my main coaching program, I do introduce, we don't really work with user stories as much, but tasks and epics, and I introduce that toward the end. But when I'm getting writers started, to me, I distilled that idea down. I call it, you want your work in manageable, movable bits,
Oh,
and that
yeah,
you
it's
want to.
more digestible.
Yeah, and that, I mean, I've been in the corporate world where people are like, this, they'll have like these epic debates on what's a user story versus a
Oh
task.
yeah,
And I'm like,
yeah.
that is not necessary for writers
Yeah,
getting
they don't wanna
their
get into
work done.
that.
But this idea of breaking your work down and being able to move, because a lot of times I'm asked about flow and how do you create flow? Well, to create flow, it needs to move. If you have a big, massive pile of work and you're just trying to shove it or drag it all the time, but if you keep just taking a small bit of work and then
Hmm.
you get that done, and again, we talk about definition of done, you make it so obvious, then you move that work to done, and then you get that done boost, which builds your motivation, your confidence, this feeling that, oh, I've got this. And then you just get more, and then you're in flow, and it's more likely that you can achieve that kind of more official state of flow where you lose
Yeah.
yourself. But bottom line is you're making solid, consistent,
Progress. Yeah.
human-sized progress on your work.
Well, it's kind of like in software development. The reason why we like, we don't like waterfall as much as we like,
Mhm.
the agile is like we can go and do point one, point two, point one, one,
Yep,
one, point five,
yep,
and we can keep on doing incremental development. So
right,
we can keep on moving the ball forward. With where waterfall, it was like this 100-page document,
right.
and it was
Uh,
so
I
tight to
started
deliver.
my career as a business analyst, so I built some of those
Yeah,
100-page documents for you all, and I was like,
I
"This
still do
is
it.
pointless."
Yeah, and we still live in a world where banks and insurance companies are still heavily waterfall. I'm
Yeah,
actually working right now on things that are 100-page documents because they still are using COBOL.
yes,
We're still using old school mainframe COBOL systems that require that level
yes,
of discipline. And then there is a discipline to actually having to do that. And then it's like,
right.
well, how do you get up in the morning and decide you're going to write a 150-page document that's a technical document? It was a total, well, because we have a structure and because
Right,
we have to hit deadlines. And so I think like, it's hard for artists, I think, to have deadlines though. Do you find that like trying to is it your
well,
process not throw deadlines? It's maybe not timeline is intensive and more like just moving the ball forward.
so as a project manager, I'm kind of a little atypical because even in the corporate world, I recommend that people only put due dates to things that really have due dates. Because in the end, if you're working in an agile method, every time you move something into, well, if you're doing Scrum into a sprint, technically it has a due date, the end of that sprint.
Mhm.
But
Yeah.
I want to trust the developers, the QA folks on the team to I trust them. I trust they're smart people. I trust that they understand how to manage their work. And so sometimes when a lot of times it's really a little bifurcated that I have writers who are like, "Oh, process,
Yeah, they
like,
don't want
oh.
anything to do with
Eh,
it.
But then I have writers who come in who are locked into process.
Yeah.
And
Very
our and I call it a little I one of the concepts I talk about is due date weaponry, that
Mhm.
you're trying to be so harsh and you're pushing yourself to get something done versus, in my philosophy on time is that time is time and it gets a bad rap, and that most of the things that people traditionally call time management have nothing to do with time, like prioritization. That's different than time management. And so
Yeah.
we actually work on skills that are less time, I'm like, time will sort itself out. And I'm working on changing a writer's or an artist's relationship to time. And
That's
so
interesting, but yeah. So one of the things I've talked to some fantasy writers, and they
mhm,
spend a lot of time doing world building,
yes.
right? So they might say, "Well, I'm not ready to actually finish the whole outline because I'm still building this part of the world, right?
Mhm.
And I got like a dream came to me or something again. I'm going to keep on detailing this aspect of the world, but then it's like the rest of the project isn't going because well, you could say you're still progressing because you feel this world needs this level of detail.
Right, and what I talk to writers, and I really don't know if in other art forms writers get this as much. With every writer individually, the I would be more interested is that fantasy writer completely comfortable with their process and moving forward on their timeline, if so, awesome. But if they're feeling like, oh, I'm supposed to be moving more forward more, or I'm supposed to be writing, or I'm supposed to be doing this, another thing that I talk about, it's a very project management thing, is owning the full scope of your writing work. And some writers are going to be more, I'm just going to start writing. Even some fantasy writers will be like that. And they'll either build as they go, or they'll tighten up the world building afterwards. And
Hmm.
other writers, part of their process, if they give themselves permission to embrace that part of the process, will be more extensive world building. And I think we have to claim as writers, there's a lot of, I should be writing every day, I should be doing this. But if you elevate only writing above everything else, it becomes
Hmm.
harder from a motivational perspective, from a confidence perspective, if part of your process sometimes involves work that isn't writing, which the reality is it's gonna
Yeah.
it's gonna
There's a whole thing in the creative process where there's a point where you get like diminishing returns. Like if I'm a musician and I'm in the studio for 8 hours trying to redo a bass line like 99 times, probably by the 99th time I'm so far away from the original intent, I probably ruined it. And so a lot of times what we try to do is like you got to walk away in order to
right.
kind of get away from it and see the bigger picture. Because if you all you're thinking about is that one bass line, right? It's kind of like you could equate that to other things. Like if you're in the story, like, oh, I'm thinking about this one plot line, I'm thinking about this one character, and I'm having a hitting a wall, and they keep on hitting the wall for 8 hours, rewriting the same thing. So maybe you move on to something else. Maybe you take a break. Maybe go take a walk. That's part of like opening your mind is like if you walk away from it, then you come back to it with a fresh perspective.
Yeah, and I think, even in my agile based process, there's a planning, the doing the work, and then the reflection period. And it's fascinating to me that even in the corporate world, people want to ditch the retrospective. Like, this is a waste of time. We just need to get on with the work. Just let us do it. But all right, are you recognizing that? But what that pause does is give you the spaciousness to say, you know what? I, okay, I spent 8 hours. I really looped on that. I want to experiment and play with moving on. Or some writers may say, you know what? Just where I am now, I just had to loop on that. And maybe I still need to loop on it. I keep returning the artist to what I call power keeping. But the only way you can stay in power keeping is if you pause to check in. Am I still on the path that I want to be on? And it's those pauses. That's, basic
Yeah.
project management principles, slow down to speed up. And so those strategic consistent pauses is one of the ways you build that confidence and trust of your own creative process into how the way you're working with your art.
There's one thing you mentioned in some of the bullet points I was reviewing. It was like there's like four creative productivity styles and why it's important writers should know what they are and understand what their style is.
Mm. You want to hear about those?
Yeah.
Okay. So, um, to me, there's a spectrum of healthy productivity. And on one side are what I call steadies. And on the other side is what I call surgers. And then, a range in between that. And so steadies are the type of artists who are really served by things like have a daily word count goal. They're just, it really supports them to have that steady process. I, on the other hand, am a total surger. So if I let all this noise in the world that tells me if I'm not writing every day, putting words into the page, I'm not committed or I'm not a real writer. But
Yeah.
for me, from a process perspective, the adjustment I make is instead of having a daily word count goal, I give myself a weekly word count goal. And then I can surge within that week. And if I get all my word counts done in 2 days, then great. It's still a short enough time period. I can keep myself in consistency and on track. So that is the range of healthy productivity between studies and surgers. The problem is comes in where the most of us want to be maxers.
Hmm.
And a lot of people will pick their most productive day. I wrote 10,000 words today. And then they're like, I should be doing that every day.
Not
So
fun.
Chargers think whatever their most productive day is, they should be trying to do that all the days. And then a study, even
Yeah.
if they're, if someone is consistently knocking out 1,000 words or 2,000 words a day, I mean, that is awesome sauce. But they're
Yeah.
thinking, I should I have this
If you're doing
surgeon
10.
friend, but I don't know that that's really what's happening, who knocked out 6,000 words in one day. I should be trying to push myself up. And so you get out of alignment. So everybody's trying to max, which is not sustainable creative productivity. And then everyone tends to think they're kind of like sluggards, which is the like the
Yeah.
bottom. Like if they're not maxing, they just think whatever their natural creative productivity style is, for some reason, quote, wrong. And then they start perceiving, their inner critic comes in, you should be going harder, you should be going faster, you should be going hardcore. And what I kind of, what I tell people, look, if you've come to my blog, which is all about sustainable creative productivity, and you're on a mission to be more productive, I can pretty much guarantee you are not a sluggard. you
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
but what we just want to do, my goal is to help people feel confident in their own creative and productivity styles.
Yeah, I think that's the problem is that people compare people, right? Because think about it, like with musicians, like sometimes a lot of times, like you end up having a peak of creativity. There's a period where you just things that somehow align and you do like some of your most memorable songs and they all kind of seem to happen from the same period. And then you might have a struggle where, the audience doesn't connect and doesn't see your work to be the same as that work. So you end up
Mm,
competing with yourself. A lot of times you
mm,
end up competing with a version of yourself or what your
mm.
most popular point is. And you have to just get beyond it. It's like, well, you gotta, it's like, you're not always going to hit that. And you do it. But a lot of times what we do is that we just do it because we love it. You do it because you're passionate about it. And you just find that, the artistic process is hard to define when you're doing that type of work. And, we got guys that will take, years off and then come
Right,
back. You got people who record every day. Like I'm one of these guys that
right.
records pretty much every day,
Yeah.
put stuff down, and then it's just like I just like to do it. Other people will do it for spurts, then go on vacation and not come back to it for months, if not years. And you're like,
Right.
wow. And it's like there's nothing wrong with either way because some people
That
that's what they have to do. And when you compare yourself to other people, you start running into problems.
right. And I think, to me, the invitation is always to be inspired by artists who have different styles, to be curious, to say, okay, let me do an experiment where I do something every day and see what I learn from that and see, because I think, I also talk about your creative code and your creative context. This gets into your productivity too. And so, what is your natural code, how you like to create? What is your productivity style? But also your context. So, sometimes I'm working with, uh, coaching working parents with full time jobs, kids, the spouse, other family
Yeah, had
obligations.
a lot going
And
on.
yeah, and so they may want to, go up to a garret and write 3 hours a day, and they're convinced that's their creative code, but that you have to balance your code in your context. And for me, the exciting thing about being an artist and a dancer, a musician, a writer, a potter, a comic book artist, to me, it doesn't matter. Whatever your métier is, your creative code and your creative context both change over time as you grow as an artist. And that to me is like, okay, let me go observe. Why I'm always curious listening to other writers or artists' processes, not necessarily that I think I have to uh, adopt all of that, but that
Mhm.
it gives me sparks of inspiration to experiment with my own process, which to me is again just as much of an art and a craft as experimenting with my writing, trying different genres, etc.
But it's also you gotta remember, like, well, within the arts, like, dreams are part of the process,
Yes.
travel,
Hmm.
talking to people, meeting people. So I understand the musicians that say, "You know what? I'm gonna go travel for 6 months, and I'm not
Right.
even gonna pick up the guitar. I'm gonna
Right.
take those life is and then put them into my next piece of work." Because that is like it's like that's a legitimate way of thinking because these like experience in
Right.
life actually helps your art. And so not just being on the keys, not just being on the bass is like actually going out and experiencing the world,
Right.
whether you're walking in the woods or going to Africa for an expedition or whatever, you like just experiencing life as a human being, you can
Mm.
process that and that will actually help your work. And you
Yes.
just
I
measuring it by how much you do every day does not necessarily a total measure of what you got to do.
Right, and, once I dated, it's on a certain level, it's like introvert or extrovert, and, like, some people will be renewed by that regular connection to their work, and other people will need, like, the replenishing or the outside, sparks, and we all, I think, need both, but to different degrees, and once I am an introvert, even though I do a lot of public speaking and a lot of out and I'm on stage, I'm definitely get my energy from being alone, from being quiet. And I was in this crazy, crazy, period of work, consulting, flying around. And I was dating a guy who was definitely an extrovert. And I was like, I'm going to New York. And I was so happy. I was like, it's New York, but I'm going to have my own hotel room. I'm just going to like after work go. And he was like, oh, well, you could stay with my friends on their couch. And I was like,
Uh,
huh? I was like, we're going to have a conversation because if you think that that would be relaxing for me,
yeah, it's not relaxing for
no,
some
no,
people.
no.
Yeah, it's hard. It's like, are you gonna go rough it in the Amazon and go in the woods into the rainforest with a biologist, and you're like, you're not used to that, right?
Right.
And you're like I don't think like I'm not, I like walking in Maine because or New Hampshire. I
Mhm.
live in New Hampshire, but like taking a walk in Brazil or something, it's like I don't know if I could do that.
Yep, and you know what was it was so I mean, and what was so fascinating to me is he was so genuine. Because for him, that would have been more replenishing and more nourishing and renewing than staying at a hotel by himself.
Yeah,
And I was like it was just a moment where I was like, "Oh, now I understand." Like, at the deepest heart level, the difference between an introvert and an extrovert.
yeah. I was talking to some European musicians that kind of go to those hostels, or
Mhm.
and I'm like, wow, I can't do that. I can't.
Yeah,
It's like 'cause
yeah,
like, it's like a Grateful Dead living. Like, it's like going to, like, a Hey Ashbury style, like, the way musicians used to be. Oh, yeah, they could be in San Francisco and live in that kinda hippie commune thing. It's like, well, I can't do that.
yeah.
'Cause
Sometimes I
so
think, you know what? The reality is it costs a little more money to be an introvert when you travel.
yeah, it's like, I'm not as social as that. I can't be just lying around wherever I end up,
Yeah,
hitchhiking here and hitchhiking there. It's like some people are part of the process. And that is
right,
what they feel comfortable with, and other people, you're like, you have to know. I think where the problem is, like, where people try to feel that they have to clone other people. We're kinda in
right,
a world where people wanna clone what works, and
right.
then I think they start to lose the authentic, version of themselves, and being a producer, I'm always trying to tell people I work with is I like to take your demo, and I don't wanna turn it into something that Taylor Swift's doing. I want to take
Mm,
what you did and make it
right,
the authentic version of you. And a
right,
lot of times they want to make it whatever's the top 20 going
right,
on, and that's not exactly them. And so
right.
they want to transform into something that they really aren't. And I'm like, really, like, it'd be better to actually focus on what you're good at and accentuate it.
Right. And I think, when I work with writers, a lot of times the productivity advice writers get is a little harsh. Just get your butt in the chair and write. But for me, what's interesting is is you know, figuring out what is the block that makes a person feel not safe being their authentic self. And
Mm,
so a lot of times, people are like kind of excited because no one shares their writing in my program because I'm not an editor. I'm a process. My genius is in understanding and assessing process. But I think it's important for us to be, and this is where the inner kindness of my approach comes out, and the idea of meeting yourself where you are, that sometimes it's not just forcing yourself to do something, but getting the when you work with yourself and figure out, okay, how can I feel more safe being my authentic self? And maybe it is finding a producer like you who is encouraging to say, hey, it in this space, let loose. We can find that in ourselves. We can find people around us who will keep encouraging us to say, look, I want you. And so sometimes it will take a little bit longer for people to get to that authentic expression. And as being a potential audience member of that person's art, I'm I the wait is worth it when
yeah.
people get that. The way, and to me, that's the magic of what I do, is that it's not always to push your art, but to what you're talking about, to really connect to you and then see what art comes out of that.
Yeah, because sometimes, like, I know there's this perfection culture
Mm,
because we have computers that can make things perfect.
mm,
What I find with art, though, and maybe writing is more precise, but a lot of times with music is what we find is like the 3rd take or the early takes are more authentically closer to the original intent of what the artist wanted to do. And by the time you get to,
yeah,
like, take 100, person has totally rewritten or gotten scared of what they originally did at take 3 and totally kind of ruined it. And a lot of times as production people or engineers, we have to convince the artist that, the original thing with all its flaws actually is more beautiful than what you're trying to make perfect because
right,
it's actually closer to what we feel as a really heartfelt feeling that we think is going to connect, and you get scared of that. And so what
mm,
happens, what we see with musicians is they get scared of it and they try to edit it out and then becomes kind of antiseptic and doesn't have
right.
feeling. And then you're like, that's technically perfect, but it doesn't have the power that the earlier thing had.
So that what you just said sparked two things within me. And one was when I started out as a writer, I had two goals: to write well and to write to delight. And as I grew as a writer, I realized my perception of what writing well was, which was based on, you know, grade school grammar, learning good sentences, starting with phrase, all these rules, that to write to the delight, your writing is actually a little less correct. So,
Mm,
learn that confidence to be free. And then the other thing that I was thinking is, I think that take to what you're describing, to not have it be like when you get to the 60th take, that if there's still magic in it, that to me is when you have a real artist. And I was listening to some clip going around social media where Matt Damon and Ben Affleck were talking about Robin Williams doing the take right at the end. Oh, now I'm drawing a blank on their movie that they're
yeah,
break,
they did. Yeah, that really good movie. Yeah, I know which
and
one.
that where he says right at the end, "Oh, he stole my line," and they were talking about he just kept doing takes and could riff,
Yeah, he's
and
very
then
good at riffing.
all yeah, and that is to me, that's a great artist when you can do those takes again and again, and there's still magic in them.
Yeah, they're different. Yeah, that's just kinda like the whole thing where I always point out, like, a classical musician versus, like, a jazz fusion musician.
Mm,
And I always thought, like, well, classical musicians should be able to technically come in. And what I found is they sheet read so much that if you bring them into a fusion kinda situation, they aren't as comfortable as you would think. They're a master musician, but they're not used to
yeah,
riffing. They're not used to
yeah,
riffing. They're used to reading Beethoven or Chopin. And so if
right,
it's not written for them, they don't know what to do. They don't feel it the same way that a jazz musician or even a jam band
right,
musician playing like blues.
right,
A lot of the music like that is feel based, it's moment based, and
right,
you kind of riff off what's going on. And you have
yeah,
this like a situational awareness to it, like what is going on right now
right,
and inside you and the crowd outside you, and you do that moment.
yes.
And that's not something that's gonna be the same every time, it's gonna be different.
Yes. I have a similar, I grew up ballet dancing. I was in the civic ballet for my city and but I also did jazz and modern, and there was this beautiful ballet dancer in the company. She could not do modern dance. She could not release out of the lift and that just it's a different type of
And
dance,
it's
and
different type of
I
thing,
think
yeah.
jazz and modern is totally informed by ballet. That's why the Alvin Ailey Company is, to me, is such beautiful dancers because they have that training plus the freedom. But
The
yeah,
freedom,
I
yeah.
definitely. And it's interesting. It's that I'm talking to a musician and a producer with Goodjelly, and some of the fun that I have in this. My process is called jamming, that you
Yeah.
learn how to jam, which
Yeah,
is, has a very musical, you know, that
yeah.
you're playing the instrument of your process, your craft. So yeah, that's fun. But
Yeah, well, I think that's so hard today because people have a tendency to clone to the point where they sample. And what is that? Is
mm,
they take something that already existed, don't and like where a lot of music before was, okay, I'm gonna interpret
mm,
like Miles Davis, but I'm not gonna do it line for line. I'm gonna interpret it. I'm gonna interpret this line from a Dylan type of song, but it's not exactly Dylan. But now people
okay.
want to just take exactly what Dylan said and just move
Mm,
it and
mhm.
take it and move it around on a clip. And that's not the same as actually interpreting it and coming in with a different feeling like a Neil Young interpreting a singer-songwriter feel like a Bob Dylan, but he's coming from a different perspective. So when
Mm.
he does it, he has his own version of it. It's not the same. It's like I say when Stevie Ray Vaughan covered Hendrix's Voodoo Child. His version of Voodoo Child is a Texas bluesman's interpretation of this cosmic psychedelic thing. It's not the same. You could hear it, but you put them side by side, but they're not the same. They
I'm
sound
going
similar, but they're
yeah,
not the same at all.
I am going to trust that all your listeners just followed everything you said, because you just went so far beyond my musical know-how that I'm just take it away on that one.
But what I'm trying to say is, like, people like, there's a point where you can interpret and have your own and somebody could say, "Well, I love Stephen King, but I don't really write word for word like him."
Right, yeah, and to me, that gets into, I think I lived in France for a while and took some art, drawing and painting classes, and in art, there's copy drawing where we would copy the lines of master artists, and sometimes I think it's useful to not, copyright has a particular marketing copywriter and a copyright from a legal perspective as well, but to like write a paragraph of Stephen King, write a paragraph of Eudora Welty, write
Mhm.
a paragraph of Jane Austen, because you can feel into it, and then of course, you know to your point, the difference between sampling and interpreting, did I get that right?
Yeah.
awesome that you want, but that to me, that's again embodied cognition, even if you're typing it in, to feel into the rhythm of the way someone else writes. Because to me, maybe a musician would interpret it as musical, but for me, writing is very, I'm looking for the beat that I feel
It's
in
like
the
a
writing. And I
frequency.
think that becomes from my dancing.
Yeah, it's like a frequency to everything. There's a
Mm,
frequency, there's a like a poem has a meter, and
right.
some prose can have meters to it,
Yeah.
and, you can get into the feel, and, I think
Yeah.
what I'm trying to get is the feel versus, like, a carbon copy, and the
Right.
problem I have today is, like, now you got people that got AI, and
Yes.
you can say, "Well, just" and then and the problem is like, well, some of that stuff is grabbing other people's work, and people think it's like, oh, it's taking original stuff. It's actually kind of just grabbing it, and maybe you don't even know it grabbed it like verbatim.
Yeah, and sometimes people ask me about AI, and I'm like, you know what? It's to me a lot of content that sometimes I can recognize it when I land on a page where there's AI that like it's you that you can somehow you can, at least for me, you start to see the pattern that it's a little repetitive, or but
Yeah,
from a process perspective, I'm like, it's still not going to free you up from managing your work and managing your process. If you just use a bunch of AI to generate a lot more content, you just have to manage a lot more content. So, in what I do, I will leave the philosophical, the moral,
mhm.
ethical, all that stuff to just to look at it from a practical, tactical perspective. you know, Process management of your art, your work, your content is still something you have to figure out. And it just becomes even more uh, urgent as, whether it's AI generated or from your heart, authentic generated, it's still content you have to manage.
Yeah, you still have to manage it. He's like you still have the responsibility of making sure that it's authentically your voice. And if it starts pulling from all these other places, then maybe it's not. And a lot of times it's like to me, it's just there's a bunch of other ethical issues and
Mm,
legal issues about it. But to me, it's like if you're an artist, why would you want the machine to write what you want? To me, as an artist, being an artist, I like my personal expression.
right.
So why would I take a percentage of my creative expression and give it to some machine? Whatever.
Well,
Like
and I
it's like
think to me, that's, I guess I once a group of we were celebrating a big, delivery of a project, and we were out for lunch, and I was just listening to these developers talk, and I was like, you know what? I just love people. And even if I disagree with what they're doing, what's always curious to me is like what you said, why would they do that? But there's probably an inner logic of why they're doing that. And of course, from a writing perspective, I'm curious to figure that out, because then I can have more range in the characters I write if I can really understand that. But it
Mhm.
also allows, if I'm working with a particular writer, I so far no one has been AI focused who has come into my programs. Um, but that whatever the thing is that is getting in their way or not getting in their way, to be curious about that, and then you can start to figure out and help them identify what would unleash their creativity and move them out of a pattern if they don't want to be in that pattern.
So it seems like you really have to like what I've done a lot of times is I try to create like list,
Mhm.
like a top 5, top 10. And I find that like when you have something so big, right? But if you take it down to like what are the top 10 things I really need that are important about this, or
Mm.
the top 5, then you can start to target. And we
Right.
and I think it's like once you start creating these like defined list or figure out the context of what you're doing, like see the big picture. So the
Right.
idea like an agile is this context diagram of the whole thing, right?
Yes.
So you get this whole big picture and you can just kind of map it out and you can visually
Right.
piece it out. And so is that part of the process of this looking at the whole context of what you're doing?
Yeah,
And
it's actually my the one of the groups that I work with is I was like, they were like, you have created so many tools for us. We need to step back. And so I'm actually making a concept map of all the tools. But to me, I totally understand that. And sometimes I go both ways. I can go bottom up on things. And I'm like, for me, having a strategic framework is super, super useful. But I know that some writers and the way some folks' brains work, they'll get to the detail first and then go up.
Mhm. Yeah,
And
yeah.
so again,
It's kind of where you are.
it's ensuring that they feel supported instead of kind of defending and digging in that it only has to be this way. Rock that and then weave in the strategic, and then you're going to get the magic.
Yeah, well, it's kind of this thing of like, do you do something sequentially or do you kind of go from different points?
Yeah.
Right. So there's some points where you could start from the middle, where you could start from the
Right.
end point or somewhere here. And there are processes that are very sequential in music production, and
Yeah.
there's other processes that are kind of like the kind of haphazard.
Right.
Like they produced like Brian Eno. He had his strategy with Bowie when he was working with them in Berlin was to take a chalkboard and take the musicians and randomly put notes on the chalkboard and tell them to just throw them into the song
Mm,
with no context of what scale, what key you were in. Just do it. And it would get the studio musicians crazy. It's like that doesn't work, and he'd say, "No, just do it." And it was just trying to get people to think out the box.
right.
And people were so into structure and so into being in tune, and he was trying to do dissonant music.
Mm,
So dissonant type of music is going to do stuff that's like off scale.
right.
That's like so it's not something you would naturally do.
Right.
It's something where you're like, well, I got to correct that. And so
Right.
it's like trying to come out of left field. And so is there a whole thing to like any kind of random process where you
I
randomly do
so
stuff?
I had the my process is very welcoming to whatever your thinking style is. And so my brain does work in frameworks, so I will come up with different frameworks, and for some writers will find some frameworks more useful, but I think to me that's the joy of playfulness to say, okay, let's get, let me do a random thing like that and let me play with structure. And to me, that's how we keep refining and growing in our creative code and in the process. To not feel like just because this worked for me yesterday, to me there are foundational process things, but within that there's so much range for a person's personal creative productivity style, and to really embrace that, but to learn some basics so you know how to play the instrument of your own process.
Yeah, yeah, you got to have the fundamentals. It's kind of like you got to
Yeah.
know. Like with musicians, we practice, right? So you
Right.
recommend a certain level of like practicing certain techniques in order to be productive. You means you've got to be like comfortable and familiar with certain steps, right? So that means you must have to do some level of repetition or at least understanding of what that framework is, right?
Right, and that's what, like the writers I've worked with, their ahas of late. I've had some writers who've been working with this process for nearly a year now, and they're like, "Wow, it just becomes deeper and richer and even more freeing." So absolutely, just like a writers learn how to create plot or character or setting, I want them to have that same adeptness and know-how and, understanding, so they can have that same facility with how they're getting their writing work done. And so that's what I teach. It's don't do writing, I don't do editing. It's a very
Mhm.
specific kind of unique thing that I do.
Well, I think we had an awesome discussion on, I think, a
Yeah.
lot of cool ideas that writers who have been hitting blocks or want to be more productive. And there's like anything in life, there's no wrong way or right way to do it. You got to
Mm,
find out what you're comfortable with. There's
yes.
certain things that are going to help you. Like if you go to your website, the
Yes.
www.goodjelly.com, and forward slash way dash masterclass, you can check out that what's like a free masterclass, and then
Yeah,
you
that's a
can
45-minute masterclass that kind of is my strategic framework that talks about process, power, and kindness. And then since you brought up blocks, I will say it's kind of hidden right now. I don't know how long it will stay up, but if you go to my blog page, which is www.goodjelly.com/blog, there's still another freebie up called how, eh, uh, unlock your blocks. And
oh,
it's an
cool.
audio lesson from me for handling artistic blocks like a project manager, which project managers handle blocks all the time, with a worksheet so that you can have that as well. And then you can also find me on League of Good Jelly on Instagram. And if anyone ever wants to talk about writing and writing process, just, you know,
I think it's valuable because like whether as musicians, we always end up writing. We write lyrics. We write
right.
like we
And that's
sometimes
all
create.
poetry.
Yeah, it's poetry. Sometimes it turns into like rock operas or concept
Yeah,
albums. So it has to have a structure that's like a short story, you
right,
know, like or like an epic poem. And so there's always something to learn from getting to be a better writer, especially in music. It's not just all playing the notes. It's like also understanding language and how to communicate better and how to be more effective. So I think anybody who's an artist can look at this, and I think they would do well by checking it out. But we do have to leave tonight. I'm sorry. We normally like to speak longer, but we have another scheduled podcast. But
absolutely. It's been a
thank
pleasure. Thank you for having
thank
me.
you. Thank you very much for being on the show, and have a great night. Thank you for being on the Family Electric Ghost program.
Thank you.